Morning, everybody. As promised, we are going to be starting right here at the top of the hour because we have a lot of material to cover. I want to thank you all for joining us. My name is Greg Dario. I will be joined here in a minute by Len Rio, the President and General Manager of the Attivo Group. We'd like to welcome you to our ongoing Macola Training webinar series. Today's topic is MRP Basics for Macola. Before we get started to the meat of the presentation, I do want to just cover a couple quick logistical items. Today's presentation should run for about 50 minutes, plus or minus, with some time at the end for Q&A. If you do have a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature on the webinar dashboard. I'll be monitoring that throughout and make sure we get all of those questions answered. At the end of the presentation, I will go ahead and open up everyone's phone line so we can have an open discussion. I just ask that if you don't have a question, self-mute your phone so we don't get inundated by background noise. We are recording this webinar. That recording should be available by the end of the day tomorrow, and we will also make the slide deck available to anyone requested. So with that out of the way, we're just going to go ahead and jump right in.
Okay, so just a couple of notes about Attivo in case you're not familiar with our company. We're a full-service Macola VAR, have been so for 24 years now. Most importantly, under the new Unity Partner Program, we are free to work with any and all of our customers or those customers of Exact Direct. And one of the things that we do provide for Exact Direct customers, those that have support with Exact, is we provide supplemental support programs. That way, for the small implementation projects, reports, things you can't wait for Exact on, whatever, we're here for you. One of our specialties is credit card integration for Exact Macola. We've continued to roll out new features, and we have a very exciting web-based product that is super secure coming out. One of our main services that we provide to pretty much all of our customers is business process assessment. We've come up with a methodology that is very affordable, very complete, and allows us to quickly work with your management team to put together an implementation plan to deal with the highest priority issues. Many of you know we also provide cloud hosting for Macola. We have done that for a number of years now and kind of learned the ropes. And we're pretty much supporting customers in almost every state. We have resources, consulting resources in all of the various time zones. So that said, I'd like to just talk about what we're going to try to accomplish today. The key here is to kind of understand the purpose of MRP, the inputs, outputs, the master data that it's going to take to make it work, how regeneration happens, and then the various kinds of advice that MRP will provide for you. And there's also the entire piece of execution assistance that kind of automates the job of the buyer planner. But most importantly, I want you to come away with a sense of what it will take to get MRP running for your company if it isn't already in place and running. And if you are already using MRP, perhaps you'll pick up some knowledge on the subject as we go, because this is not something that you can learn in one setting. So let's get started. So why would we use MRP in the first place? Well, at its core, it's an inventory planning tool. So it uses all kinds of data within the Macola database, item information, BOM information, all the order files, lead times, that kind of thing. But it's only a planning tool. It provides recommendations and advice, on what to order and when. It can be the best assistant you could hire to ensure the highest level of customer service with the lowest levels of inventory if it's used properly. So that's it. It's really a suggestion box, and it produces advice for two things. Number one, how does your existing plan look? Should there be any rescheduling of existing orders, or advice to create new replenishment orders that don't exist yet. So, and just kind of as a point of reference, MRP will always suggest rescheduling an existing order before it will suggest creating a new order. So let's talk about some of the inputs and outputs. This diagram shows the major inputs like item data, stock quantity, what's on hand, bill of material information, quantity per, all of that kind of thing. All of the open orders, what we're referring to here is customer orders, both supply and demand orders. So whether it's customer orders, forecast orders, or replenishment orders like purchase orders, manufacturing orders, all of those are considered. And certainly scheduled receipts and scheduled receipt dates are extremely important inputs. But the output is pretty simple. It's basically advice. You need to consider it as that. It's not going to solve your material planning problems. It's going to give you advice on how to solve them and leave it up to you to take action. And I'll say this again, there is no harm in running MRP in your production environment because it's only like advice. There's no transactions that are going to take place when MRP runs until you take action on that advice. Now, there are a number of settings. We're going to, unfortunately, have to kind of bore you to tears for a few minutes to kind of explain all of the settings that are necessary to make MRP work properly for you. So there's a couple of system settings. These are package settings or module setups, depending on the version of Macola that you're using. But there's definitely a manufacturing setup, then there's an MRP application setup, and then there are two very important calendars that we're going to talk about, the shop calendar and the reporting calendar. Now, one of the things that you're going to notice is that I'm actually using screenshots from Progression MRP. The screenshots or the screen data is exactly the same in Macola ES and Exact Macola 10. So I apologize for that, but I'm sure there's a number of Progression users out there that can relate to this. I just want you to know if the screen looks different, that's why. But let's talk about the manufacturing setup. So the reporting calendar identifies the buckets of time that you want to consider for planning purposes. So for example, maybe we go through the planning exercise weekly. So we want to consider a weekly reporting calendar or have several calendars set up so we can look at the multiple summarizations of the data in certain views. The default material plan calendar is one of your shop calendars. So even if you're not using shop floor control, it is necessary that you have at least one shop calendar set up in the system that will then be the default, okay? So and the purpose of that calendar is coming up quickly, and I'll show you that in a second. There's also something that we're going to be talking about called a firm planned order in MRP, so sit tight on that one. And lead time usage, the answers here are either fixed or variable. If you use fixed, this MRP looks only at the planning lead time on the item master. If it's set to variable, then it looks at that planning lead time, plus it makes a calculation of the variable lead time required for manufacturing orders to produce the quantity that is required, and it essentially adds the actual runtime times the number that are needed and adds that to the overall lead time and backs up the scheduled date accordingly. So let's take a quick look at the reporting calendar. First of all, the reporting calendar is, again, only for the purpose of choosing the way that reports and views will display for you. You can have a number of reporting calendars set up, as I mentioned, weekly, monthly, quarterly, or it could even be user-definable, meaning it's really important for you to look at 8 periods of time in weekly summarizations. After 8 weeks, I want to look at a monthly requirement, and then after 2 months or 3 months or 6 months, I want to look at a quarterly requirement. So you can actually have a custom-defined reporting calendar and have it be kind of like a hybrid. So whichever way you choose, there are 64 periods for you to utilize, and keep in mind that on a regular basis, you should come into reporting calendar maintenance and update the start date so that it kind of keeps moving forward. There's no reporting before today, so the number of periods starts to diminish if you don't continue to move them forward. The shop calendar, and if you take a look at this date range, this would actually be an invalid shop calendar to use for MRP if this was the default, because the start date was 06, the end date was 2010. I wish I knew then what I know now, but unfortunately MRP won't know what to do with any kind of orders. It looks at the date and goes, I don't know what to do. So it'll give you some wacky dates back in 1996 or 2027, or it really will be a problem. And if you see those, it's probably because your shop calendar, the default shop calendar that MRP is using, it has a date range problem, and you actually need to come into this maintenance window and extend the calendar date outside of your most future requirement so that it knows how to handle that most future requirement. And by the way, on this particular screen, it also says to stay within an 8-year time span. That's a progression limitation. That does not exist for Macola ES. It certainly doesn't exist for Exact Macola 10. But notice that there are 2 date ranges, whether or not the shop calendar the work centers are associated with. If those work centers are open or closed on those days, that's what the first open-closed window is for here. I'm referring to here, open. And then include in MRP is a separate question. So for example, your shop may be running a 6 or 7 day a week calendar, and maybe you have a minimal crew that's operating on the 6th and 7th days. You may only want to consider the 5 Monday through Friday days for purposes of having MRP schedule or recommend purchase orders, certainly, because I can't receive on a Sunday if I don't have my receiving crew here. Or I just want to reserve the capacity and not have MRP think that we're open Saturday and Sunday because I've got a reduced crew. So there might be a lot of reasons why the work center is open and has this particular shop calendar related to it, but MRP needs to have a different consideration. I hope I was clear on that, but you can control when MRP will plan as compared to when the plant is actually open. Also, the hours per day are important, particularly when you're using variable lead time, because here we're showing just an 8-hour day. If there were 16 hours or 24 hours of capacity, that would be a whole different variable lead time calculation. So there's 2 buttons there for extending the range or copying the calendar to a forward date. Also, I should mention this calendar is blind to any holidays or days that your plant is actually closed for inventory or whatever purpose. That range button will bring up all the detail day by day, so you can go in and manually close Christmas Day and the 4th of July and whatever Monday your company's holiday schedule will have the plant closed. So you're essentially affecting a single day using that range button and closing the shop, so MRP will ignore that particular day. The MRP setup basically there's a starting MRP order number. There's also a forecast calendar to use, and this consumed forecast setting. Those particular settings apply to when master scheduling is in use. I'm not really going to cover a lot about master scheduling today. That's a little bit more information that we can actually share in 1 hour. But I'd like to talk about the formula for quantity available. We recommend using available inventory is only what the system is showing on hand. In other words, we wanted to ignore allocations, we wanted to ignore on-order quantities. Just tell me what's on hand, because I'm going to let MRP go look at all of the open purchase orders and all the open demand orders, and I'm going to create my own allocated quantity, my own on-order quantities, and give you the right answer. Because most of those who are using MRP know that allocations and on-order quantities get out of whack now and then, and that's what that whole reset allocation, reset on order is for. So the rest of the checkboxes down below are the defaults that will be used when you say, hey, I want to regenerate MRP. I'm going to talk about those in more detail, but in the MRP setup, that's where the defaults are coming from. And the second page of MRP setup is identifying, the source of any demand orders and supply orders that may exist. So here we have a company that is using shop floor control. We want to consider, shop orders as well as unreleased shop orders. And notice too that you also have the opportunity to include quotes so that you can have MRP plan for open quotes, especially if you're managing the minimum probability code that gets entered on an individual quote. So you might use 9 as the minimum, and anything that's kind of flaky, you might call it an 8 or below, and MRP will ignore those quotes. So that's important to know as well. You can also include blanket orders, and master scheduling comes into question down below again regarding forecast. We're going to cover that in a minute as to how other ways can be used to enter forecast orders besides master scheduling. And the last page is entered through that MRP CRP locations button, and this is where you turn warehouse locations on or off as it relates to being considered during the MRP regeneration. So this is, again, a default. We're in the MRP setup. This can be changed at runtime, but this is essentially the question of, is that location nettable or non-nettable? So we will consider something like MRB, some kind of a non-conforming location, a customer returns location, might be a consignment location, could be anything that you've got set up for whatever purpose that you want to have MRP ignore in terms of quantities on hand. And that's exactly what we do here. Is just a yes, no, on or off. So those are some of the global settings. Now let's talk about the individual items. Remember, MRP is an item-by-item decision. So there is no such thing as, oh, we're running MRP, and it gives you all the information that you need about all items. It does not. You have to specifically identify an item as being planned by MRP and then make some choices that we're covering now about how you want MRP to handle that. So these are a couple of examples, but let's take a look here. First of all, the item must be active. So it can't be a forecasted item. It can't be obsolete. It has to be active, and it has to be active within the correct date range. Also, MRP will look to the item category. Do I need to create a purchase order or a manufacturing order? That's kind of important because many companies need to create a bill of materials for some of the items that they actually purchase from vendors. But so you have to actually flag it as manufactured to create the bill of material. But in order for MRP to understand it, remember, MRP doesn't have any common sense. It's going to do exactly what you tell it to do. You have to change it back to a purchased item. You can still see the bill of materials so that MRP will create a purchase order for you. Otherwise, it's going to create a manufacturing order, and you're going to say, oh, I can't do anything with this. I'm buying this now. It's a very common issue, but just keep that in mind, that this particular flag is important. The location is really important to MRP. A point to consider is that at this time, and I'm saying this for Progression, Macola ES, and Exact Macola 10, Macola MRP is a single location MRP system. So for example, if there are 3 warehouses, including the default warehouse, that are creating demand against an item, MRP will summarize the demand and then recommend a single replenishment order for the default warehouse. So it won't create 3 separate orders for the 3 locations for the right quantities. It's going to create a single demand replenishment order in the default location. That's being addressed in Exact Macola 10, the multi-location question, and actually is scheduled for release, and I think in the June 30th release of Exact Macola, the EM 10.4. Another important thing to consider is that you may be purchasing in certain units of measure, but MRP is blind to purchase units of measure. It can only make recommendations and consider quantities that are expressed in the stocking unit of measure. Now, one of the most important elements on the item master setup is the order policy code. I'm going to cover these in pretty significant detail, but I'd also like you to know that there's a consumed forecast flag on this screen that has to do with items that are being forecasted, either as through master schedule forecast and merging that master schedule into MRP, or by creating forecast orders directly in MRP. Typically, forecasted orders also have customer orders, and this particular flag tells Macola MRP how to deal with quantities that are already on order and a forecast order. The most typical flag setting is that MRP should consider the greater of customer or forecast orders. There's a couple of other options like forecast only, customer orders only, a number of items like that. But if an item is flagged as master scheduled, you have to answer that question. So that's the consumed forecast setting. So let's talk about order policy codes. So if you do nothing and don't actually set an order policy code, MRP will not plan for the item. So this assumes that you are using a reorder advice report or some visual method for placing orders, and you don't care to have MRP make recommendations for you. Fixed order policy code is used for items where maybe you have a large setup and you always produce 25 of these or 100 of these or whatever quantity. And because that happens to be kind of an economic order quantity for you, and or it fits into a certain Kanban container or something of that order. Lot for lot is used especially where a shop is make to order, because if you're not making to stock, there's typically not a fixed order quantity. You're essentially only making something if there is a customer demand. Now, the problem is that MRP matches each unique demand with a replenishment order. So if I happen to have demand for 28 of something in the next 30 days, and it's flagged as lot for lot, MRP is going to give me 28 computer planned orders, a unique order for each replenishment requirement. Period requirement might solve that problem. With period requirement, a time frame such as 2 weeks or 1 week or 30 days or whatever is identified at the item level, and MRP will then summarize all of the demand that is due within that period and recommend a single order for that period identified. And then reorder point is kind of another approach. It's kind of like using the reorder advice report or min-max inventory management, and MRP is just looking for that inventory level and the reorder level, the inventory quantity on hand and the reorder level, and as soon as it drops to the reorder level or below, it says, oh, time to make more of these or buy more of these and order up to whatever the max is, and that would be the difference between the reorder level or the quantity on hand, and the max will be the recommended order quantity. So it's a way of using reorder level, but then also being able to take advantage of MRP's execution capabilities to help get through all of that detail. Continuing with Item Master. We're almost done, I promise. This will only take another 50 minutes. So the lot size, that entry on the Item Master, is only used with fixed order policy code. Remember, the fixed order policy was, I only produce this in lots of 100 or 25. I know they used the wrong designation. It sounds like lot for lot. It isn't. Fixed order and lot size go hand in hand. The planning period is used with period requirements to identify that planning period, and that's in days, and that's in shop calendar days. Oh, no, I take that back. I'm sorry. The planning period is actually in calendar days because it's looking at the customer orders. And the time fence days are the number of days from the day that you regenerate for MRP not to plan within. In other words, ignore it. The manufacturing method is pretty clear. That's going to create either a shop order or a POP order, whichever you tell it that item is manufactured by. The buyer planner is used on a lot of the reports within MRP for sorting and filtering. And the planning lead time is very, very important. This is the lead time that determines the start dates of any requirements. So the due date of the requirement is X. The start date is Y. The formula is simply X minus the planning lead time equals Y. That's how it gets to it. It's really simple, and it is looking at the shop calendar. So it is backing up based on the shop calendar. It's skipping over Saturday, Sunday, the 4th of July, and telling you when that order should be released. Not shown on this screen is the P&IC, or Planning and Inventory Control Code. That's a user-defined field and also helps you categorize items in reports and sorting. So, last few things, the planning order multiple. If there is a planning order multiple set, this will actually work for all of the order policy codes to essentially help you identify quantities very much like a fixed lot size. The order up to and the recommended minimum, the order up to is the order max level. This information is all getting kind of copied over to the default item location record. And then safety stock, that's the minimum quantity to be kept on hand to buffer against uncertainty of supply and demand. So MRP will consider safety stock as part of a demand. So all of that stuff that gets entered on the item master defaults over to the item location record, and that's where it actually gets picked up in terms of MRP regeneration information. A quick note about manufactured items that are set to force demand pull. In other words, make to order type items. MRP will not create a planned order for pull items. However, it'll kind of ignore the parent item that is already created. You've got a generated order that needs to be acted on. MRP will consider the components and subassemblies for that pull item, though, so that's important to know. So we discussed the nettable locations, and of course those have to be turned on and for MRP purposes. And keep in mind, you can turn the switch on and off for various purposes. That happens at regeneration time. You can say, oh, I just want to consider this location and not that location, and for whatever purposes you might need to. But always, 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 planned orders are created for the primary location only. So you may need to change the order location once MRP makes a recommendation. All right, a little bit about the item location setup. In order for MRP to recommend a purchase order from a particular vendor, there has to be a primary vendor. So that's the main use of the primary vendor. The buyer planner comes over, order multiple, that is also used by MRP from the item location. We spoke about reorder levels, and this is important for reorder policy code only. The dock to stock and the PO lead time go hand in hand, but it's the PO lead time that's critical for purchased items. And this is the safety stock entry for again, the default location that MRP is going to consider as part of demand. And then the recommended minimum order will be displayed on the reports so that you can use that as one of the inputs for making a decision as to whether or not to take the action recommended by Macola MRP. It might be higher, the recommended minimum order might be higher or lower than what MRP is telling you to do, but it will not actually use that number as part of its recommendations. On page 3, where you have the item quantity on hand information, it's going to pick those up from the item location record. And I had mentioned that that MRP regeneration should be set to A, available, equals on hand. So it's going to ignore any on order or allocated quantities that may appear in the item location record, unless you specifically said, hey, you know what, I want to consider on order, and it's a purchased item, and then I went over to the MRP setup, and I said, don't copy my purchase orders in. I want to consider the on-order quantity here on the item location maintenance rather than the quantities from the purchase order. So bill of material, as you might imagine, is a very important input for MRP. So it's exploded during regeneration and uses the quantity for assembly and requirements for components are summarized for MRP planning purposes, and based on the order policy code for the component, computer planned orders are created. The pegging information is a term that we haven't discussed. Is created if you tell the regen process to create it. It traces the requirements back to the source order. So it has to go back through the bill of material and say, hey, what happened? Why do I have this computer planned order for something I need to purchase? And that information is available in reports, pegging reports and views, so that you can understand all of the requirements, essentially validate that, yeah, we need to buy this many or this few. So the BOM is a very, very important piece of the puzzle, and it doesn't matter how many levels you have in the BOM. Some people prefer to use a planning bill of material, one that is very flat rather than having 10 or 11 levels deep, just because it's easier to understand a flat level or a single level bill of material as compared to 10 or 11 levels deep with all the lead times and so on and so forth. So, but that's kind of an advanced topic. So the bill of material information, as I mentioned, is using the quantity per assembly, and the shrink and scrap quantity or percentage is a very important piece of the puzzle. And during regeneration, you'll be able to make a choice. Hey, do I want to include the scrap that is going to be created so that MRP will essentially gross up the requirement? So if I really need one, I'm going to consume 1.2, so I better be planning for 1.2. And the item must be active on the bill of material. Just a note on that, you got to be careful of this activity flag. Let's say that you created a brand new component today and added it to a bill of material. And the effective date was today, in other words. So then you have a demand order, and it requires the planning lead time is greater than the time that is actually available to produce this product. In other words, you're going to have to expedite it. Well, because MRP, when it does its math, is going to say, oh, wait, you need to start this order on February 15th, and today's February 25th, it's going to look at the activity date of the component, which is February 25th, and it's going to say, oh, the item wasn't active then, so I won't even tell you about the fact that you need it. So that's where it can kind of burn you. So you need to think about that when entering an item. You're going to regenerate MRP. It needs to be within its date ranges. Okay, now that we got it all set up, let's talk about how processing works. It's essentially 3 steps. You run the regeneration or regenerations. You analyze the reports and the data that it's presenting to you. And then you take action. Essentially convert the planned orders or take the advice on rescheduling existing orders and begin executing the job of the buyer planner. So the regeneration screen, when it comes up, looks vaguely like the MRP setup screen. So there's a series of questions here that need to be dealt with. And the starting one is the formula for quantity available. There it is, set to A. And just to cover a few of these, resetting low-level codes does consume quite a bit of time if you have a lot of bills of material and components. So but it's really important that low-level codes are reset on a regular basis because MRP logic uses this information in its processing. So it's important that this is performed regularly, but maybe you don't want to do it during regeneration because you want to just regen it, I don't know, at lunch or break or whatever, and get it and see if you've created a plan that makes sense for your company. Serial audit activity. That would be really important if shelf life of components is coming into play with items that have some significantly future dates for the end item. So you may have ingredients, especially like in food processing or something, that may not have enough shelf life when we execute that production order 3 months from now that MRP is telling us about. Subtracting safety stock from quantity available does not change the requirement that MRP is planning for. It still sees it as a demand. However, the reports that MRP puts out basically subtracts it from the beginning balance like it didn't exist. Or, if you will, it essentially hides the safety stock for you. Now, if you do check this on and you start looking at the reports, you're going to realize that the beginning inventory balance does not agree with the stock status. That's because of this checkbox. So, personally, I find it a little bit distracting, but in some cases you may need to use it. We talked about using the scrap factor for MRP. This is where you can say yes or no. In some cases, your company may use scrap factors to get product costing right or for whatever other purpose. However, from a material planning perspective, I don't need these shrink or scrap factors. There are some places where we're going to manually enter MRP transactions. You may or may not want to purge those out. Then there's the question about generating pegging information, like reset low-level codes that will add processing time. Not a whole lot by comparison, but it will add some time. The display processing information window, or checkbox rather, is going to give you the status of where MRP is in its regeneration process. I'll show you that in 1 second. And then the initialize all MRP regeneration files, I would highly recommend that that is done every single time unless you have a reason to retain some of the regeneration, the previous regeneration, and keep what was there and then add to it. That's kind of an advanced function, and really need to know what you're doing with that. There's the button to add, remove MRP locations. Again, going to default from MRP Setup, and you can change it on this particular regeneration. This is the display that gets presented to you and when MRP regeneration completes. And in this particular case, it looks like it took about 6 seconds or so. And notice the message down below. Records merged into MRP have an invalid date. Please check the shop calendar. We talked about that. We may not have a shop calendar that extends out far enough to support the demand requirements. We may have demand requirements outside of that date, ending date of the shop calendar, and MRP is going, what do you want me to do with this? So it couldn't even be before. That would be a lot less likely, but that's how MRP will react. It'll give you this message, and you really need to act on this because you have some bad data now in the advice. So speaking of advice, MRP actually offers advice 2 different ways. And its goal, by the way, is to create a materials plan that supports the sales plan. That's the only reason why we have buyer planners, and that's the only reason why we have buyer planners creating a material plan. So, first of all, the exception messages are providing information about orders that are in some way not in support of the plan or are no longer in support of the plan. So, an example of some of the exceptions that you will see on this report are, hey, the order's too late. So and that means if the materials are received on the current order date, they will be late, causing further disruption to the schedule. And clearly you need to expedite this order if at all possible. Too early. You got to slow this one down and move its date out, unless it won't have a material effect on your operations. The order has too many, or there's too many orders. It's giving you a message about specific orders, and it could be saying this about a number of orders. So it's basically higher than needed, and if it's appropriate, you need to reduce the order quantity that's in the system as it exists. Too few, shortage situation if it's not remedied, or no requirements. Sometimes the material planners have done a great job and there's a customer order cancellation, and all of a sudden the requirements are no longer needed. And this is a really great tool to help catch those kind of mistakes, because we certainly don't want to bring in materials that are no longer needed. So in terms of output, there's really two main outputs, and that is computer planned orders that are, again, it's the suggestion box, the recommendations for buyer planners to consider and perhaps take action on. The other types of outputs are the analysis reports. I'm going to touch on those in a second here. And the purpose of those is, well, you wouldn't blindly just order stuff if you weren't 100% sure that you really needed them and you needed them at that particular time. So those reports and views help you understand and then validate those recommendations. So the reporting actually comes in terms of two different flavors, if you will. There's analysis reports, the MRP by date and period and pegging report and so forth. And then there's action reports. These are things that you should do. Planned orders, purchase request by vendor, exception reporting. And this is the material requirements by date report. So if you notice, the dates are on the left and starts from the earliest of demand or supply and goes to the latest. So there's requirement, orders listed, prior inventory, scheduled receipts, and so on. And out to the right, you'll notice there's a column for type of order. That's one of the things that you'll need to, we have a couple of cheat sheets. Here's the type of orders and what those abbreviations mean. MR is a material requirement, POU is an unreleased purchase order, computer planned order, and so on. There's also exceptions out here, alerting you that even though, hey, here's what we think you should do, you need to take a look at these exceptions. When we were talking about those, too many, too few, too late, too early, those all have letters that would appear on the exceptions report. The MRP by period report is a different cut of the same information. This is one where the date buckets or the time buckets run across the top, and the information is presented to you in a master scheduling type view. And what I mean by a master scheduling type view is, what did I start with? What are my demands against it? What are my planned orders to deal with any shortcomings on quantity on hand? And what will my ending inventory be at the end of that time bucket? So what we're looking at here is the monthly reporting calendar view. So this is a summarization of all of the activity for the month for this particular item U wheel. And it always starts with the prior inventory. In our case, we had 0. But there is something to note on this particular report. That always kind of confused a lot of people, including myself. It's scheduled receipts. The computer planned orders, even though they are displayed here, are not included in scheduled receipts and therefore not included in net inventory. So notice that the net inventory is above the computer planned or planned orders. So in the month of May, we have an actual shortfall of 15 and the computer planned orders of 15, but we carry over minus 15 to the June period. This has never been my favorite view, but there is a remedy. I'm going to talk about that in a second. The remedy is actually creating what is referred to as a firm planned order. A firm planned order can be changed from a computer planned order. It's one of those actions that you can take. It's considered a scheduled receipt. In other words, the buyer planner has looked at the computer planned order, which is MRP's advice, and said, yes, I agree with that. Or in doing the conversion, it said, I agree with that, but I want to move it up a week and I want to increase the quantity or whatever the case was. So there's a couple of reasons for doing this. Number one, you may want to have MRP acknowledge that you've understood that requirement and you've acted on it. But you may not be ready to issue a purchase order yet. You haven't even finished collecting quotes from vendors on this particular item. You just know that you need it by that date, and that release date makes sense to you, so you can convert that to a firm planned order, and all of the future MRP regenerations will plan around it. So there's a lot of reasons why you might use a firm planned order, but that's a pretty classical one. Then later, the firm planned order can be converted to either a purchase order or a manufacturing order. If you prefer, and you're real sure about a particular computer planned order advice, you can convert those directly to a purchase order or to a manufacturing order. This is one of the most helpful views, very much like the MRP By Date Report. This is a view of the same information. The nice thing about this is that it has drill down capabilities, so you can analyze the information. It will also allow you to click into the period exceptions and identify which exceptions you want to have displayed or not. And it will show you all of the detail of the requirements, the replenishments, and or the planned orders. So the exceptions report is, I think this is one of the most important tasks that a buyer planner can do. If I was hiring buyer planners, I would be talking about, tell me about how you kept things on plan. The goal of MRP and the goal of MRP exceptions reporting is to create a plan, a materials plan, in support of the sales plan, and make sure by using tools like the MRP exceptions report that we are continuing to walk in lockstep with that plan, and we are going to make all of the dates that we have committed to our customers. So this report is what's going to tell us what's going left or right on us. And out to the right, you can see the exception situation, too late, too few, and so forth, and what the order is. It identifies the order so that you can go in and take action. So very, very important piece of the puzzle is the MRP exceptions report. I should probably take a moment, just a quick second, to talk about the regeneration process and the sequence of events. I'm a firm believer that MRP takes at least 3 generations per planning cycle. So let's say that you have a weekly planning cycle. The first regeneration that maybe happens on Sunday night or Monday allows you to to jump in, roll up your sleeves, and start issuing orders and rescheduling things and expediting and so on and so forth. Once you've done all of that work, you then need to regenerate the material plan so that the exceptions report can be a useful tool. Probably the first time around, it's going to be telling you so many exceptions that it isn't very useful as exceptions reporting until you actually do some planning. Then the idea is, oh, here's all the exceptions. Let me take care of this, that, this, that. There's still probably a lot of them. So you go about correcting those situations. Then it kind of requires another regeneration, because now you're probably at Wednesday, Thursday. At this point, have there been any new demands that just jumped in there that just absolutely need to get addressed? Or in my second planning exercise, did I capture all the exceptions, act on them correctly, and is there anything else that's just waiting for me to bite me if I don't take care of this? So regeneration is an iterative process. It needs to be done according to a schedule so that everyone can get their work done, especially where there's multiple buyer planners. You don't want to move everybody's cheese around right when they're in the middle of working on a plan. One of the outputs is the planned orders report. This can be run for just manufactured items or just purchased items, along with other filters such as date range and so forth. And the purchase request by vendor report is kind of similar to the computer planned order report, but it displays the orders in vendor sequence and includes a little more vendor-specific information. Like there's the contact information and the phone number and just silly things like that that make your job a little bit easier. So now when it comes to taking action, this is the kind of process that you would use to generate unreleased purchase orders. So it's telling us about the quantity 15 from vendor 100 that we need to order, and that it's due by 5/15. Well, I may click in here because this is a drill down type of tool, and I may say, you know what, I don't want to buy it from vendor 100. I heard they're going out of business. I don't want this quantity. I want to increase the quantity to hit some price break, or that date, I want to back it up or move it out or do whatever I want. You can make all those changes. You select that item, and then click process, and off it goes. You will then have an unreleased purchase order with all of those settings. Similarly, you can generate shop orders. Again, you can change the location, the quantity, the due date, the start date, whatever you want, and then, again, select the item and process. It will create a generated shop order for you. And if you are using production order processing, you have the same kind of screen that will create pop orders for you. And this is the MRP Planner, or the MRP Workbench. It's kind of an all-in-one tool for both analysis and execution. It can be used to review exceptions, analyze requirements, as well as take action to convert computer planned orders to purchase or manufacturing orders. This tool is pretty robust, and it isn't something that we can really cover in great detail today. It deserves about its own half-an-hour discussion to fully understand its capabilities, but it kind of pulls together all of the tools that we've been talking about, the various reports, the planned orders, all of those kinds of things, tremendous amount of drill down and around to analyze and options to execute. Okay, this is kind of the last slide that we're going to talk about in terms of functionality within MRP. This is the actual MRP order entry screen. So in addition to MRP considering customer orders and supply orders and so on and so forth, you can actually create orders directly in MRP for it to consider in terms of providing advice. So for example, this is where you might, if not using the master scheduling application for sales forecasting, you might come to this screen and enter a forecast order for a particular item, due on a particular date or location and so forth. You can also use this screen for purposes of converting computer plan to firm planned orders, or firm plan to PO or whatnot. So it is a pretty important function. So now that we've covered a lot of considerations for how MRP will run, let's just have one quick discussion about deployment. So if your company has not already begun using MRP, these are just a couple of points that I'd like to talk about. Number one, I think it's important to kind of start small, meaning identify one product category or items from one particular vendor and set those up for MRP to provide advice for you. I would run MRP in your live environment. Remember, as I mentioned, there is no transactions that take place as a result of running MRP. You actually have to physically go take action from MRP's advice, okay? The other important thing about your live environment is that it has accurate dates. So everything is current. We don't have to worry about when did we last copy the test company and all that kind of thing. So there is no harm in using the live database, because ideally you want to have a little bit of parallel runtime so you can take a look at what MRP is recommending versus the conventional manner in which you're planning for those items and determine who's right. MRP may have better recommendations for you, or we may have missed an important part of the setup for an item in order for it to give you an accurate recommendation. Certainly, I would consider more training than this, maybe a little spelling help, but this is one of those things where learning takes place over a fairly long period of time. There's a lot of tools within MRP. It's not a lot of black magic, but there is just a lot of moving parts that are important to understand in order to be able to utilize MRP efficiently. So those are just some recommendations. The other aspect of this is I think that MRP truly takes an implementation plan with goals and objectives and timelines, or it will never be completed. Management needs to have visibility. There's a lot of decision points that are going to need to get bubbled up to top management, perhaps. As far as a training plan, for the kinds of customers that we work with from start, ground zero, in other words, there's some 16 to 24 hours of initial training, detailed training, that includes a lot of assistance in setting up the pilot items, followed by a few monthly reviews and questions and answer periods to keep the MRP deployment plan on track. So those are some things to think about if you are considering undertaking an MRP project. So that concludes our presentation on the material. We're a few minutes over, but I'd like to open this up to questions first.
Great. Thank you very much, Len. We did have a few questions come in over chat that we'd like to cover before we open up the phone lines. First one is, this individual, their company has a lot of old orders that have never been completely closed out. Will that be a problem for MRP?
Yeah. A messy purchase order file is going to be a problem. You know how that happens. It's like, well, we ordered 10,000, 9950 came in, but we didn't bother to go close the line out or even close the PO. Well, even though it was 2 years ago, MRP sees that remaining 50 as valid supply. Well, the vendor's late, probably be on the exception report, but the best way to go about that, and we've done this a number of times, is to use some kind of a SQL query to close all of the offending purchase orders kind of in a large group. And then, you know, the information that purchasing is going to purchase orders will make a whole lot more sense. But it will be confusing if you don't clean that up.
Another question, if you can use the routing lead time roll-up report to set lead times for shop floor items, what about POP items?
Oh, good question. The lead time, remember the planning lead time, is a critical piece of information, right? Because MRP does all of the time phasing. You know, if you're using shop floor and standard routings with it, you have the lead time roll-up capability that writes the correct answer to the planning lead time. If you are using production order processing, you don't have that capability, so you actually have to manually set those planning lead times by entering them into the item master. So unfortunately, that's a little more data to enter with POP.
And then what is a planning time fence used for?
Oh, well, we covered that briefly, but the planning time fence is really, let's say you get a rush order from a customer. You know, MRP is going to give you invalid information because it doesn't know any better. If you've got a 2-week lead time on an item and a customer needs something within a week, MRP is going to tell you to start last week. Well, that's information that I can't really act on, and I've got to start expediting. So it'll show up on the exceptions, but it's not going to give you a valid advice recommendation. So you can actually set a time fence so that says, look, if I'm within 7 days or 3 days or 1 day of my planning lead time, just ignore it. I have to expedite it anyway. So that's its purpose. We just want MRP to ignore items inside the time fence.
And then the last question that came in on the chat before we open to the lines is, can MRP be used for what-if type planning?
Yes, definitely. There's a number of what-if kinds of tools that are built into MRP so that you can answer that question for a customer or your sales department that wants to know, hey, how soon can I get this? And it will allow you to add demands into a regeneration to give you that what-if picture. So it essentially can take a previous regeneration, add in additional information to see where you would stand if that order actually happened.
Alrighty, we're going to go ahead and unmute everyone's phone lines. Again, I just want to reiterate, if you do not have a question, please self-mute your phone so we don't get overwhelmed by the background noise. But at this point, we've gone ahead and opened up everyone's phone lines. If anybody has a question.
Yeah, it's an instant.
Here are a whole group of people in the background.
Yeah. Exactly what that is.
So are there any questions?
Exactly what it is. You're caching it in memory there, the table, in your own thing. So.
Here's though, let's throw Bonnie, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. We currently have MRP, and I don't know how to run the exceptions report.
Okay, that is one of the standard reports in the MRP reports menu.
Yeah.
Where do I get that? I go to MRP?
Yeah.
Reports and graphs?
Yeah, hold on one second.
Okay.
I only have Exact Macola. What version of Macola?
Gosh knows. How would I know?
The screens look like the ones that we were on our presentation?
No. I have an old version, I'm sure.
Okay.
But I can read you my choices.
Sure.
there's under reports and graphs under MRP, there's material requirements, and that only appears to be by date. Oh, number 7, Macola 7.
Oh, okay.
Pegging, net change, what if, which doesn't seem to work. Oh, exceptions, MRP exceptions.
That's the one.
Oh, that's it? Is it that easy? Oh, my God. Is that easy?
From here on out.
Now, well, there are a lot of choices. If you can,
I know.
You know, so,
I used
and
to
by the
run
way,
it where I used to work, and there's a key somewhere to what all the exceptions mean, right?
yes, there is. And there's a bunch that you probably want to exclude.
Right. Where do I get the key to all of them?
You can actually find it in the help file.
In the help? Okay.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Fine. All right, I'm going to try that. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Are there any other questions? Well, it appears as though we're coming to a close here. So, just want to have just the last slide here. Our upcoming webinars.
Oh, yeah.
We run 3 per.
I think those are the most recent that I just received, like yesterday, I think. Yesterday or something.
Or, you know, kind of, an hour.
All right, so on Thursday, March 10th, we're going to do another Making Macola Work and cover things like security setup. That's kind of part 3 in the series. And then on the 17th of March, we're going to cover the eBiz suite, which is composed of the eBiz Connect and the eBiz Charge applications, which is super secure credit card processing for Exact Macola. So it's going to be a pretty informative session as to how security needs to be deployed in your environment for security for credit card processing. I'd like to take this time to thank you for attending. I know we ran a little bit over. This was a big subject. If you have any ideas for future webinars, please let us know. And you can help us in order to give us time to do this kind of thing. Hey, make us a referral. That way I can, instead of doing a whole bunch of marketing, I can do more educating. I enjoy this more anyway. So there's our contact information. And once again, thank you for attending, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar.